Welcome to the second of this semester's seminars. We're lucky to have Sinead Pembroke here today about the Industrial Reformatory School story, and I'll be discussing afterwards. But yeah, I'll hand you over to Sinead.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Okay, so this is my thesis topic that I'm going to be talking to you about today. I've spent so far 3 years, well, it will be 3 years on it. I've conducted 23 interviews, and I've also looked at about 10 biographies of individuals who have attended industrial reformatory schools in Ireland. So that's what today's presentation is going to be about. Just to give you a quote here from some of the research that I've been doing so far, just to highlight sort of why I'm doing it. It's a quote from one of my participants. "It was as if I was cultivated on stony ground. I was disadvantaged from the start. I would liken it to a house with no foundation. Eventually the house was falling in on itself. The foundations not being there, the walls would eventually just collapse inside." And I think that sort of, as an opening, that shows you just how much these industrial reformatory schools did have an effect on the afterlife of these individuals. And what I hope to show is that it also has an effect on the afterlife of Irish society as well. So before I just show you, I have a little contents thing. Do I point it? Oh, I have to point it there, all right. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so basically I'm going to give you first a brief historical overview, then show how the church domination in the domains of education and welfare had something to do with all of this. I'll go over some theory, Foucault, labelling theory, and Goffman are the three that I'm focusing on, although I do admit that there are a number of other theorists we could go with, but they're the ones that I'll explain afterwards, I've chosen. And then finally the legacies of industrial schools, so it's interpreting the data. So I started off here with this brief historical overview at the penal laws. It doesn't mean that I'm going through all of this, by the way, but the reason why I'm starting off, why this is a turning point, is because, well, as you know, the penal laws were a clampdown on Catholicism in Ireland. It denied Catholics the right to land, Catholic education, a prohibition was put in place on religious orders and the clergy being trained in Ireland. So all of this, as it says here, was that the hope was that Catholicism would die out. However, that didn't happen, and instead we gained Catholic emancipation in 1829. Now this is very relevant because it was at this time that basically the Catholic Church and, as you will see, the religious orders kind of cultivated their power within the Irish people. So what I focused on, and the reason why I focused on Catholic Church's domination, education and welfare, is because that is, you know, that's the domains that they focused on, and that's the domains where they gained their power in Irish society at this time. So basically they took over in education. They, you know, as I mentioned the hedge schools before, well then it sort of transformed into national schools. It's not my job to go into the history of it now, but, you know, safe to say they were quite dominant in that area. And then also welfare, so, you know, hospitals, and in this case industrial schools as well, if you can call it. Some people debate whether that's welfare, but for the sake of argument. So basically what we have here, what happens is there was a growth in religious congregations from the 1820s onwards, and the influence came from Dr. Cullen, who was Archbishop of Armagh, and he was also Cardinal in Ireland at this time, and he saw to it that there was a growth in an influence from the church in the provision of its welfare services. So during 1849 to 1878, this is when he exerted most of his influence, and he saw to it that, you know, that this sort of idea would be fulfilled. And he was very prominent in, as I say, you know, sort of engendering the religious orders and getting them to grow. In 1854, the Reformatory Schools Act was passed, and in 1858, the bill was passed into law. The Act relied on voluntary agencies to set up the schools. In return, they would be aided by the government. This bill allowed for the child to be sent to a reformatory school and to be able to go to one of their own religious persuasion, which is very important here, because this is how the Catholic Church sort of, gained such dominance in this area. So the bill basically in 1868 then another bill was passed which saw the establishment of an industrial school system. So that's why we've got industrial and reformatory schools. And it was the industrial schools that proved to be more popular with the religious orders. In 1899, 71 industrial schools had been established and incarcerated 8,422 children. So we can get a general idea of how they were already growing even pre-independence Ireland. Okay, so the religious orders that as I've been saying, have been growing during this time, and they not just, as I said, influencing education and welfare, they influenced the area of these industrial reformatory schools. Sort of when they saw these acts being passed, they thought, right, this is our time to shine, to get in there and, exert power. So the Sisters of Mercy, they were not only prominent in establishing orphanages, but became heavily involved in setting up the industrial schools. Now, of course, there were other Sisters of Charity, there were others, but the Sisters of Mercy have been sort of shown to be the most dominant of the the orders of nuns. According to Barnes, by 1873, 25 of the 34 industrial schools which had been established for Roman Catholic girls were managed by the Sisters of Mercy. So we get an idea there that, they were very dominant. The Christian Brothers, they were the dominant, as you all sort of familiar with the Christian Brothers, dominant in establishing boys' schools all over Ireland, and they established industrial schools. Some to name are Artane in Dublin, Tralee in Kerry, Salt Hill in Galway, and one in Limerick City, and these were all established in the 1870s. And then some time later there was also Letterfrack and Killybegs and Donegal. And there's many more. There's a whole system of industrial schools, as you know. So the aim of all of this, not just the reformatory and industrial schools, but this dominance in education and welfare from the Catholic Church, as Fahy says here, the task of the congregations first worked out among the urban poor was to encourage popular religious support through the display of a practical, caring faith of Catholicism to a hitherto neglected and often abused mass audience. So this quote here shows you why I picked the penal laws as a turning point, because that's when the Catholics sort of could be said to be suffering the most. It's when the Catholic Church sort of stepped in and, shown themselves as the saviours of the Irish people, and used the Catholic religion sort of to be different to the English imperialists. Okay. So what I'm going to go on to now, so that sort of historical element of it, is that I want to go on to the theory aspect of it. So as I identified, I'm looking at Foucault, at labelling theory, and at Goffman. Now, why did I pick them? Because I'm looking at the idea of power structures and, sort of the idea of, well, all of them are to do with total institutions. So how institutions such as industrial schools can influence wider society. So I'm going to begin with Foucault. So basically, the book that I focused on here is Discipline and Punishment. And basically what as I was saying before, is that I want to link the institutions with wider society, and Foucault does this in his work. He talks about that the techniques used in institutions, such as such as the industrial schools, demonstrate how power operates in society. So basically, as Foucault identifies, imprisonment is also enveloped in a mechanism of a power now founded less on spectacle than on continuous surveillance. So he's talking about here the change of power, because in his book he's talking about a change of power from sort of, disciplining the body, and now it's about disciplining the soul. So of a power given over to the chores of the classification of individuals and their placement and documentation, of a power which is geared to the training and the dressage of individuals. Okay, so what this all boils down to is the idea that the body must be disciplined and controlled. So it's the idea that it's trying to control individuals, it's trying to make society, and well, he's talking about in institutions, but to make people conform, docile, etc. Power and knowledge are codependent. So basically, relations of power depends on a vast field of knowledge, and knowledge is generated through power. So those in power define what is normal and abnormal behaviour, which will be important later on for the presentation. But basically, what I'm taking from this is the idea that the Catholic Church and the authorities, the Church and the state at this time, wanted to create a docile and conformed sort of society. Okay? So Foucault identifies, Foucault is looking inside the institutions, and he identifies methods of control. So the first one is the cellular breakdown of space. So it establishes presences and absences to know where and how to locate individuals, to set up useful communications, to interrupt others, to be able at each moment to supervise the conduct of each individual, to assess it, to judge it, to calculate its qualities or merits. Okay, so as you see, that's the idea of putting people into rooms, or, blocking people away. It's to stop contact. It's to gain as much control as possible. So here we see again control, okay? The second is the timetable, and the individual body becomes an element that may be placed, moved, articulated on others. Its bravery or strength are no longer the principal variables that define it, but the place it occupies. The interval it covers, the regularity, the good order according to which it operates its movements. Okay, so again, it's about controlling. So the individual no longer has any, autonomy on their day, on anything that they choose to do, which again is the idea of empowering these individuals who are in the institution. And again, this both these ideas can actually be applied to outside society, and this is the idea that he's showing how what's going on inside institutions, is going on a wider level, that, it's all linked. So as I was identifying about the normal and the abnormal, this is a very important aspect of Foucault's work to do with discipline and punishment. And so he's talking about the idea of the norm that is formed. So as this quote says here, again, the value of the norm can be felt throughout society in their application in asylums, hospitals, and prisons, where they are sites of, so to say, dividing practices which divide individuals into the mad sane, the sick healthy, or the criminal law-abiding. So it's the idea that, basically we've got people so the rest of society is considered to be the norm, and then those who are in institutions are considered to be the abnormal. Okay? And that's the idea of individualizing everyone, is that, normally when we're talking about, I'm unique, I'm an individual, that sounds like a good thing. But in this case, it's not, because the individual is being studied, is being, they don't want, it's the idea that we don't want you to be, or society doesn't want you to be an individual, it wants you to be conformed. And this is the idea of what's going on in institutions. Okay? So what complements this Foucauldian kind of discourse here is labelling theory. And actually the one that I think identifies most with the idea of reformatory and industrial schools, because basically labelling theory, so it's talking about the criminalising of individuals, okay, of turning them into deviants. And children from industrial and reformatory schools were sent through the courts. So basically here we're looking at the work of Stanley Cohen, Howard Becker, Edwin Lemert, and other labelling theorists. Okay? So these are the offences, and I put those in inverted commas deliberately because, quite frankly, they weren't offences, but between 1868 and 1969, 105,000 children were committed to industrial schools by the courts in Ireland and 25,000 poor law children. Approximately 80% of children were sentenced for lack of proper guardianship. Only 10% were incarcerated for non-attendance of school. Less than 1% of all girls and 11% of boys were sentenced for committing minor larceny. So if we're to take, for argument's sake, I know what criminality is, it's a very abstract thing, but if we're to take, for argument's sake, basically here, if less than 1% of all girls and 11% of boys were sentenced for committing minor larceny, and that was the most criminal aspect, it means that these children weren't, in fact, criminals, but they were deviants because they were products of deviancy to society, to the society norms and values. And this is what sort of labelling theory is talking about. It's about creating outsiders. It's about othering people, because with the intention of, again, making a conformed society, of, again, basically saying that you're an individual and you're not, you're not conforming to what we want. And this is what was going on during this time, because post-independence Ireland, there was a lot of upheaval. There were a lot of different ideas about, what kind of Irish identity that we wanted, etc. And the Catholic Church, as I had already been saying before, had such a dominant position within Irish society that it wanted to make sure, and as did the Irish state authorities, that its morals and its values still were upheld. So what you find here is that these children were labelled deviants because they were illegitimate children. They were children of poverty, things like that, things that the Irish people or the Irish Church and the Irish authorities did not deem to be acceptable to what they wanted. So they sort of wanted to hide this all away and put these children into industrial schools and in reformatory schools. Okay? So just to take some quotes here, just to prove the point. Each in its way is instructive for the light it casts on the concerns, prejudices and fears of the society that thus defines its deviants and outsiders. By definition, deviance poses a norm. We can speak of what is odd or different only when we agree on what is normal. So basically, by looking at the kind of, and I again say this inverted commas, offences, we can see what Irish society were actually against at this time. So social groups create deviants by making the rules whose infraction constitutes deviant and by applying those rules to particular people and labelling them as outsiders. And this all relates to the stigma that individuals suffered after they left as well, which we'll be talking about later. So Goffman, as I said, is my third theorist that I'm using, and again he complements all of this because he's talking about total institutions, and I particularly use his work on asylums. So what does he talk about total institutions? He says their encompassing or total character is symbolized by the barrier to social intercourse with the outside world and to departure that is often built right into the physical plant, such as locked doors, high walls, barbed wire, cliffs, water, forests or moors. Okay, so basically it's the idea that everything happens within these institutions. There's no longer people who are institutionalized, no longer experience life in different places. Everything happens within these walls. And he identifies total institutions as not just being prisons, as not just being industrial schools, but army barracks, seminaries, places where there's strict control of movement, of where they can go, of basically strict control against the outside world. Okay, and the reason why I chose Goffman is because, again, with Foucault, he's quite complimentary because he's saying, basically total institutions are everywhere, or all over society, as Foucault said, the carceral city. That's, again, so it's showing how it's related to society. So basically, as the quote says there, it's a breakdown of the barriers ordinarily separating these spheres of life. The way we live in the outside world is not conducive to live inside a total institution. For example, total institutions are unsuitable for particular features in the outside world, such as family life and the ability to make your own decisions affecting your daily routine. He talks about presenting culture, which is the identity that we come in with, first of all. And the reason why he talks about that is he's saying that it doesn't suit the institutional life. So that's when self-mortification occurs. And it's the idea of basically you're mortified, your identity that you came in with is turned to suit, your institutional life. Okay? So what this effect happens is, what happens after this is that ultimately stigma and trouble coping in the outside world occur. And it's this particular aspect that I'm looking at with my work as well. So we talked about the theory. Now I'm still analysing, just to tell you I've still not finished my analysis, but I thought I'd present to you a few of my findings so far. Before I actually go into that, I should probably tell you that I should probably give you an idea of the kind of how I'm going to split my analysis. Basically, I'll tell you what my actual topic guide was. So I interviewed 23 people, and I'm keeping their identity. I'm anonymous because that's what we agreed to. And basically, the interviews averaged about 2.5 hours, and they cover every aspect of their life. So we gain an idea into what it was like to be these people. When you read this work, what I want you to gain from it is not just a sociological idea of the effects that it's had, but I want you to feel like you are one of these individuals, because I think that's what's missing in everything that's been doing in the Rhine Commission and everything. I think what we need is to actually see what it was like. So the general sort of areas that I've identified are the family life, the journey into the institutional life inside, how my respondents interpreted these events, and of course the afterlife, which also included how they coped, their relationships with other people. So I'm just going to go through a few bits here. So the first area is the family. The legacy of this system of industrial reformatory schools, what did it achieve? It created broken families. Secrecy, stigma, and shame characterized the relationships, if you can even call them relationships. I'll just read you this quote here out. It was a relationship. So this is one of my respondents and his account of when he met his mother for the first time. It was a relationship that the words to describe it could have described me or her at any point. It was embarrassing. It was awkward, guilt-ridden. It was secretive. We used to meet secretly in Tullamore and other places, and we used to use intermediaries. It was highly secretive, and I found other people put the duty on me. When I was working, and other people saying, you've got to maintain contact with your mother. And indeed, I remember sometimes travelling the day after Christmas on trains, and I'd be so cold and miserable and lonely, and I'd meet with her secretly in Tullamore or somewhere like that, and that went on for a good few years. And sometimes I wouldn't see her for a couple of years. Now, that meeting was pretty much one of the only meetings this respondent had with his mother. He met her very rarely. And this is the thing that happened. He was born illegitimate, which is most of my respondents. They were born illegitimately. And due to the stigma created in Irish society towards illegitimacy, these two individuals, the mother and the son, were not able to have a proper relationship. Something that we all might take for granted with our own parents. Family life part 2. So we've got the idea of how they experienced family life after they left the institution. And as I was talking about being institutionalized, it's very difficult to then live out in the outside world, and this includes family life. Bear in mind, most of my respondents didn't actually know what family life was like before they'd been institutionalized all of their childhood. Many, went when they were 18 months, 2 years old. So here's a quote here. Not only did they not substitute family life, i.e. by being brotherly, fatherly, sisterly, or motherly, Mother Superior was indeed inferior, especially when it came to parenting. So not only did they not provide it, but they almost programmed people like me against it, against touch, against expression of feeling and support and so on. And in fact, when I first went to people's houses, it was like going to the moon. It really was. It was so strange. It was so extraordinary, and I couldn't read the relationships, and even things like she came out of her, I can't figure out. So it was a strange setup, the concept of closeness and family life. So I left actually the swear word in there because I want you to gain an idea of just how angry these individuals are about what they experienced. Just to get an idea of what it feels like to not know what it was like to have a family, and this went on into the afterlife as well. Another aspect then was coping in the outside world. Now it should be, I just tell you that when they were released at 16 years of age, which was the cut-off point of anyone who went to an industrial school, they were basically just thrown out there. Some of them were found placements, yes, but placements in farms, sort of with very, very low wages, dire sort of living conditions, etc. So basically, they've never experienced the outside world. They've never learned how to live, how to save, how to open a bank account. All the normal things that you would think that you would know. So this is just one of the respondents and their reaction to when they were being out. So I was fearful, and I was very fearful. I was coming into a strange world, and I was lost, and I had nobody. At least there I had a world I understood. You know what I mean? I knew there were rules. So basically, again, it's that idea of being used to the institutional life, which again had the effect of, now this wasn't for all respondents, but a lot of them went into the army, some of them even actually wanted to join the priesthood and even the monk, they wanted to join the Christian brothers. Actually, an interesting aspect of that is one individual actually said to me that he'd asked at the time if what he would have to do to become a Christian brother, and the Christian brother said, "Get out of here. You'll never be one. You're worthless." So they didn't encourage. They didn't. You would think that maybe what they were doing inside by putting them off women, etc. Maybe they were trying to give them a life into the religious orders or the priesthood, but in fact no, because they thought these children were the scum of the earth, But anyhow, so basically here we're getting an idea of just how lost these individuals felt. So coupled with the idea that they didn't have family, they didn't have anyone outside, some of them. And those that did, their family were strangers to them. Relationships was a very important aspect I identified. So making friends, in terms of making friends, here's the quote here: "I'm not in touch with friends from the school. I made no friends in the school. I felt no reason to communicate with people that didn't do anything for me. I never remember anyone saying, 'Please don't hit him,' or 'Please leave him alone' for me. So I don't make friends. I don't even have any relationship with my sister in Ireland or her husband." So that quote is in relation to the past, inmates, former inmates. And I found this is an extreme case where this individual is quite angry at his inmates, at his former friends or colleagues, in the comrades, as some were called them. However, most of them didn't really have any animosity towards their former comrades, their former inmates, but they still didn't keep in contact with them. And I think it's this whole idea of they wanted to put it behind them. They wanted to just forget and move on, which you will see I think in a few more slides, just why they wanted to do that. So even in general, to do with friends, I would be very cautious with people. I have no reason to trust people. I would trust them to a certain extent, but there are things I do not tell anyone. So even on a trust issue with people in general, it caused people to distrust, because after all, they were abused. They were abused by people considered so highly in Irish society. They were also abused by their parents, because in the sense that they formed no relationship with their parents or their siblings, etc. So, that's why it caused that sort of isolation. The afterlife and relationships again, and this is in relation to, now, not all had children, not all of my respondents had children, and actually this is something that I forgot to say. My results are not to generalize for everyone. It's not to say that everyone who went to an industrial school suffered all of this, but I'm giving you an insight into what a sample of people did go through. And in this case, this individual did have children. Not all did, as I said. So he said, "I've never held my children. I don't really have a relationship with my children. When my son walks in, my first question is, 'What do you want?' Likewise, I don't know how they feel about me. They don't tell me, and I don't tell them. I keep myself to myself. I've never held my children in my arms. I've never taken my children to play. Spent loads of time with my children. Took them to play. Took them to the seaside, holidays, America, you name it. I took them there. Gave them all I could give them. Never hit my children. I don't believe in hitting children. If somebody does hit them, I'm not shy in coming forward and saying there's no need for that. As I said, I don't form relations with anybody." So as you can see from that quote, this particular respondent did love his children, did care for them, but was not able to show emotions, which is again, and has been attributed, and the interpretations given by the respondents is due to their time in the industrial school, because they were never shown any emotions, they never had any parents, they didn't know what they had to do to become, what was done. And because they'd been told that they were worthless, shown everything, that they were just the bottom of the pile, shown no emotion, shown no nurturing, this is the result. So inability to relate to the opposite sex was another, now not for all of, well, even those that did marry, generally they didn't exactly have many women. That was the only woman that they married, kind of thing. And so there was, for all of them, and that's the same for the women that I interviewed, there was this inability to relate to the opposite sex. But here's a quote here. "This, to me, is the one area that the upbringing in industrial schools has done. It's some terrible damage in being able to form relationships, because you had no parental figures to go on, you had nothing to go on, and we never had socials in the school with girls brought in or anything. And our whole indoctrination was girls are dangerous, girls do bad things. Now I'm mature enough to know that's wrong, but psychologically that's the worst damage it's done to me as an individual. All the ones I know now aren't married. Some they broken up. Now I wouldn't mind breaking up marriages, but the fact that they were not able to form relationships like myself, and I'm reasonably level-headed, and I have met some lovely girls and started relationships and backed out because I thought I wasn't good enough. I was the one who backed out all the time. I couldn't tell them why it was me. And when we see this inability to relate to the opposite sex, I mean, this was a deliberate thing done in industrial schools for both boys and girls, was this segregation, was this idea that in the case of men, that women were bad, in the case of women, men were evil, you know, kind of thing. And you do see the legacy of it in Irish society. I mean, you see the way that schools were segregated, everything. So again, it's this, we can see here one way where Foucault is applied in this quote here. So in terms of career in education, so there was a stigma attached, to their time in the industrial school, and that's putting it an understatement. Basically, it caused them, it said, I made up a complete false childhood in my later life, particularly when applying for jobs. I made up a false education, and in talking to people, I gave them a false life. So again, sort of that idea that they wanted to put it all behind them and pretend that they were never there. As I was saying to you earlier about losing contact with their former inmates, it's the idea that they just wanted to pretend that they were never there. And there's a particular instance where here's to do with promotion. So after 8 years in the job, the governor said to me, you never applied for, so this idea that after 4 years you could apply for promotion. I said, I have no interest at all. The reason I didn't was in the interview, they'd be quizzing you all about yourself, and these are people that know you well. I said, no, I wouldn't bother. He said, I think you should go for it. You do very well. Years after, he kept pushing, so I went and I got it. Now, it was traumatic, really, because I told no one about myself, because it was traumatic revealing about yourself. But I limited it in such a way, the questions, they weren't too invasive. But I never went for promotion after that, because the next one would be higher again. And I said I did nothing wrong, but I was carrying that with me all my life. So here we see another legacy of the industrial reformatory schools, is the idea that they didn't want to talk about it. These victims didn't want to say anything about their time there, and to be able to get on with their life, that's exactly, what they had to do. Another aspect there was the lack of self-confidence, and this is with all of my respondents. They were highly intelligent people, and just so much potential. And they lacked such self-confidence. As I said, my father I'm not sure if I said before, some of you may know, he was also in one of these institutions, and a very intelligent man, and also lacked self-confidence, which is why, sort of when I saw this, this quote here, I know I've never reached my potential in life, and it's not just me saying that, I've been told it time and time again, you're wasting your time doing this, that, or the other job. You could do better than that. But I've never believed in myself enough. Believe those people. I've never had the confidence to even believe myself that I was as good as everyone else, never mind better. So basically, as I said, even those that were in the army, etc., very few went up for promotion or anything, so that's another legacy, is that you've got people here in Ireland who have the potential to do so much more, and who have ended up at the bottom of the pile as such, doing menial jobs as they did when they left the industrial schools, when they could in fact be doing so much more. So those are just a few of the areas that I thought I'd present to you, and I basically, there's many more, because they were 2.5-hour interviews. So as I said, it covers the inside the institution, because I find it's important that it should cover inside the industrial schools, because it's something that no one knows about, even at the redress board still is not high. The redress board did nothing to actually highlight what's going on inside, because people went with their stories, and they were all collected. they were given money to basically pretty much shut up. So what I want my work to do is to show what happened inside and how what happened inside affected the people in their later life, and then also in turn affected everyone. Because my dad's legacy, for example, for me, I mean, you know, I'm his family, so certain things that he went through, whatever, would have, you know, passed down to me, you know, I would have experienced. And the same for those individuals, any families they may have, or children. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this is a part of Irish history that is still very much alive. And I thank you for listening to me.
Great, thanks a lot, Sinead. I'll just attach this to this. I'm still struggling to get my head around this topic. It's an obvious kind of thing for a newcomer to Ireland to try and understand. And I've learned a lot both about, you know, what happened and the impact that it had and how it can be thought about. So the theory is important as well. All I can add to the mix is what can come from my own kind of thinking about similar kind of themes and issues in a completely different context, right? And that may or may not be useful to you because of your focus on the actual experience and the impact. But to the extent that you want to try and kind of explain what's going on, then, you know, it might be helpful. And the first thing is the fairly obvious kind of thing that you would expect someone like me to say, which is something to do with comparison, right? That just sort of make the links between what's happened in Ireland and what's happened in other countries, where you see similar kinds of stories being told about the history of the treatment of children in these kind of institutional settings. Because it's really interesting the way in which very similar kind of histories can be seen in a lot of different kind of contexts. And when you do that, then a number of kind of conceptual possibilities emerge. And one thing that strikes me is it's hard to know how to put it. You might want to think about what happens when you try and remove Catholicism and the Catholic Church from the story, and see what happens if you can tell the story without that being part of it. Because the trouble is that very similar practices and very similar institutions emerged under different flags flying above them. Right? So the fact that it was under the management of Catholic institutions, it's worth kind of putting a question mark beside that to say, well, how important was that actually? I mean, one thing that struck me when I read Tom Garvin's book, for example, what's it called? Resisting the Future, or something like that. When he was talking about the role of the Catholic Church in relation to education, was that one big difference with the Australian setting was that there was more competition there, right? So there was a stronger presence of the Protestant Church to kind of compete with the Catholic Church for the provision of education. So you can come up with a Borgesian kind of analysis about a competitive field, right? And we talk about how if you've got a different kind of degree of competition going on, then that can make a difference to the overall dynamics, especially to the role that the state plays in relation to this kind of stuff. So I just, in the end, you might still conclude that in fact, the fact that it was the Catholic Church was important, and that was an important element of the Irish story, but it's almost as if you need to take it out before you can put it back in again. The other thing that one might also then look at is whether the story that we're looking at here is one about childhood and overall, right, and the way in which childhood was positioned in society, the relationships between adults and children generally, and the kind of violence that was inflicted on children in these institutional settings wasn't, in fact, I don't know, it wasn't all that unusual for society generally. It was going on in other settings as well. But anyway, the point is to try and draw out the extent to which this is a story not just about these institutions and these institutional practices, but about the way we thought about children, the way we feel about them, and what kind of emotional responses we're willing to acknowledge and recognise. And of course, most importantly, coming from my Elysian kind of background, what we're willing to change our own feelings about in response to, right? I mean, because what you see in some of this testimony is the people who are now parents kind of reflecting on the way they relate to their own children and the effect that their experiences have on the way they can do that, in a way that the people that were responsible, in inverted commas, for them appeared to be completely incapable of. That then raises another theme about what kind of changes in overall sensibility we're kind of witnessing here, right? How we've got to a point where it's been possible for a society, a country, and a number of different societies and countries to have this kind of violence and abuse inflicted on some of its members and not kind of think twice about it. Or did they? I mean, were there critics at the time that were saying, no, this is a terrible thing to happen, to a situation where you get prime ministers and TSOCs apologising for past practices, and you get a kind of ongoing kind of discussion about how awful that was and how we should look at the effect that it's had. And then the other kind of theme that comes up is about trying to tease out what the role of the state in all of this actually was, and how you can kind of spell that out, and what it was that might have been specific about the Irish setting that produced, I don't know, a certain kind of role for non-state institutions in the provision of this kind of care. They were the main things that came up for me. I don't know how useful they'll be, but they're just kind of possible ideas to throw around in there. Okay, that was me. I'll hand it over to questions and comments from the floor.